Welcome to Open Range. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. Today we're going to be talking to Dustin Gawrylow, Managing Director of the Watchdog Network. There's a lot going on with the legislature dealing with initiated measures and power that are reserved for the people in the Constitution. So we're going to spend some time talking through that today and just understand. I sometimes don't give my legislators a lot of grief, and I think this is a case where they deserve it. So Dustin, welcome to Open Range.
Yeah, good to be back.
So it's been a while since we've had you on, but you've been busy traveling the state, talking to a lot of people. I'm on your blog, and in fact, I got to renew it. I just got a notice the other day it's expired. So tell us a little bit about Watchdog Network. A lot of people know about it, but how they subscribe to your blog and make sure that they, and I guess it's not a blog, it's Substack.
It's the modern version of a blog.
Yeah.
It makes monetizing and creating revenue and subscribers a lot easier than blogs in the old days where you had to manually use PayPal and all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of streamline things. But the North Dakota Watchdog Network is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, nonpartisan, especially on issues like initiated measure. Frankly, I spend more time going up against Republicans than anything and working with Democrats a lot of the time as well on this issue. And basically, we're an organization that is designed to keep an eye on government overreach, be pro-taxpayer, pro-voter, encourage people to be involved and oppose the hurdles and limitations that the legislature, specifically in North Dakota, wants to put in place to make it more difficult for the people to exercise their rights under the North Dakota Constitution.
Dustin, it's an interesting history. I go back when I was a young executive director back in the 80s, and guys like Leon Malberg, and I guess we could even go back to Bob McCartney. Yeah. We have a long history of North Dakotans as citizens rising up, getting petitions, getting on the ballot, whether it's Bob McCartney, I think Leon Malberg. Ken French was the master at it. Mm-hmm. He did a lot with that. And even Curly Haugland. Curly partnered up with Heidi Heitkamp on eminent domain, I believe. So
and they need to do it again because we got more problems on eminent domain.
I think that's an interesting. So I guess what I'm thinking is I'd love to have you, let's just do some background on these initiated measures. I appreciate all the things that you write and put out because you get into the weeds sometimes that we need to think about. And I always kind of say maybe you're the Rush Limbaugh of the blogs because there's times I'm thinking about something and then all of a sudden you send out an email on it. And what I love about your Substack, you go into detail, you have links, and there's the research that are supported. Give us some history on these measures and where the state's been related to that.
Yeah, so the initiated measure process in North Dakota in its current form can go back to about 1918 when the Nonpartisan League took over the Republican Party. And some background there, the Nonpartisan League was what was created when the Socialist Party in North Dakota folded. And in North Dakota, because of our primary system, the remnants of the old Socialist Party actually took over the Republican Party initially.
Wait a minute for a second. I mean, that's kind of what's going on today, isn't it? The Socialists have taken over or that are in power.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. I didn't mean to interrupt it. I just had to get off of that and not lose your train of thought.
I think that there's a case to be made that remnant has always been there and it's just never gone away.
In the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, we can definitely get into that part of it because
I don't want to lose your thought there because that initiated measure is what we're focusing on.
Yeah.
I just couldn't help myself.
Yeah. It's connected. It's definitely connected. And so prior to 1918, the only way to get a measure on the ballot was you had to go through the legislature itself to get a constitutional measure put on the ballot. When the precursor to the NPL got into the legislature, changed rules, which then allowed the NPL to utilize the ballot measure process more effectively. And that's how we got things like the state bank, state mill, and all of those sort of ingrained socialist enterprises that now are just part of North Dakota government infrastructure. And if you go to the 50s, when the NPL got pushed out of the Republican Party by what was called the Republican Organizing Committee, it pushed the NPL out into the Democratic Party, and that reduced the ability for Republicans to win because a lot of those old socialists were why Republicans were able to win in those elections between about 1918 and 1975 or so, for sure. And as you mentioned, Bob McCartney was referred to as the referral king. He did a dozen different referrals and initiated measures. He ran for governor as a Republican a couple times, and then he ultimately switched parties. And then in the 80s, you had what you were referring to with Leon Malberg, Kent French, Ed Schaefer involved in the 88 to 89 referrals trying to push back the state spending increases and the tax increases that were being promoted under George Sinner at the time when the Democrats were in control of North Dakota, at least in the governor's office. And ever since then, and throughout the history, the two oppositional factions that have successfully used the initiated measure process are the kind of socialist left populists that initially took over the Republican Party through the NPL, and then the hardcore conservatives that have used referrals to push back against government overreach, and then in the last 20 to 30 years have promoted measures that have either passed or have failed, but in general have pushed things in a more conservative way. Those are not the items that the current legislative Republicans are worried about. They are worried about these few issues in the last 10 years especially that have garnered out-of-state money to promote them in state. And we're talking like Marcy's Law, the Ethics Commission, term limits, though that was right-wing, conservative. But in general, the legislature just does not like the idea of, number one, the citizens being able to tell them what to do, even though that's the whole point of the Constitution, is to restrict the legislature's ability to do things, just like the federal Constitution is there to restrict the federal government. See, now you're breaking the rules there, Gary. But basically, when you have the citizens effectively using the ballot measure process, the legislators feel that's a challenge to their authority. And for the last 10 years especially, they have been putting forward ballot measures in the form of constitutional measures that would make the process of initiated measures and constitutional measures more difficult for citizens without a budget to work on, under the guise that it's somehow going to save and protect the state from out-of-state interests that have a lot of money to work with.
We are representative government, right? Republic. So the goal is to get someone elected that represents your interests so you don't have to be engaged all the time. But for the legislators, arrogance to step in and say we want all the power and strip that power away from the people, it's going to create its own backlash, in my opinion. And consistently, when the legislature has done it, they've been pushed back, and the citizens have told them to take a hike, haven't they?
Yes. And this goes back to the fact that Article 3 of the North Dakota Constitution, the title of it is Powers Reserved to the People. It doesn't say powers reserved to the people unless the legislature disagrees. And that's what they genuinely believe. Back in 2020, they put forward a constitutional measure that would have said that in order for the citizens to approve a constitutional measure, the legislature would have the power to agree or veto that measure. And then in order for the people to pass it, they would have to vote on it a second time 2 years later, after the legislature vetoed it. In 2022, the North Dakota Chamber of Commerce led an effort to create an initiated measure to create the 60% rule on constitutional measures, which is now Measure 2 in November. But they spent $400,000 to do that in 2022 and failed to get it even on the ballot. And the whole premise of that idea is that it's too easy to get measures on the ballot. If you spend $400,000, you, I, or Jared Hendricks, we could probably get 5 different measures on the ballot if we had $400,000 to play with. Now, and then in 2024, the citizens just rejected the last attempt to force every constitutional measure to be voted on twice, both in the June and the November election, as well as creating a single subject rule, which happens to be Measure 1 in June of 2026. So consistently, the legislature keeps coming back over and over, trying to wear down the public and wear down the ability of folks like me to be able to continue to push back on these things, because they believe eventually the voters will just get tired of these measures and vote for them.
Are there specific legislators that you would call out that lead the charge on this in particular?
Yeah. State Senator David Hogue has been the lead on a lot of these since about 2013. State Senator Yana Myrdal has been the lead on a few of these, and they wouldn't deny it. Like, they're proud of it. And the irony is, in this last special session, when the debate was over the free school lunch issue, you had the supporters of the school lunch concept saying, if we don't pass this legislatively as a statute, the people will come out with a constitutional measure and force it on us, and we won't be able to do anything about it. The opposition also said, let them do that, but this, and then explain that is why it needs to be harder to do constitutional measures. The belief that the citizens' ability to override the legislature is a danger is something that the North Dakota Republicans in the legislature, eventually this is going to come back to bite them, because the more and more they indicate to the public that they don't trust their own voters. These are the same voters that created the Republican supermajority. But the Republicans that get elected by those voters don't trust the voters to vote on these specific issues.
This June, we're going to have an initiated measure on the ballot that has to deal with a single subject. And Dustin's done a lot of work on this, a lot of research, and I want to get his perspective on it so the citizens can get spun up on this and understand what this represents. So Dustin, give us a little bit overview on measure number 1, which is the single subject rule that's going to be on this June primary, which isn't very far away.
Yeah, so Measure 1 was approved during the 2025 legislative session, and it was in the form of Senate Concurrent Resolution 4008. And it said that in the June 2026 primary election, there would be a measure that seeks to amend the state constitution to require that all initiated measures are confined to a single subject. And this may sound like a good idea in theory, but it's important to remember that, number one, the legislature itself until 2023 was in violation of its own single subject rule, and it was overturned when the Supreme Court declared that the OMB budget violated the single subject rule already in the Constitution. It took the North Dakota Investment Board suing the legislature in order for us to learn officially that the legislature didn't know how to define a single subject itself.
And let's stay with that for just a second, because the background of that is it's getting down to the last 5 hours of the session and everybody's manipulating, and rather than having one last budget bill, all these seasoned legislators hide stuff in, and stuff gets passed because now it's 2 a.m. They want to go home. They're up against the clock of how many days they can meet. That was really what was going on. So you'd get this massive spending, all this stuff hit in. It was like, let's pass it just so we can go home.
Yes.
Let's pass it so we find out what's in it, kind of thing. That's really what that was about, correct?
Correct. And you beat me to the punch on the language here, because Measure 1 does not define what a single subject is. It simply gives the Secretary of State unilateral power to determine whether a measure conforms to a single subject or not, without defining what that single subject is. Now, legislators have said that they can, if the people vote for this measure, go back and define a single subject in state law. That is exactly what you're referring to, which is we have to pass it to know what's in it. And the problem with the single subject rule, even though it sounds good, the question is, what is a subject? Is a subject a topic? Is it a article of the Constitution? Is it a chapter in statute? In South Dakota, for example, this has been highly abused in states like South Dakota, where in 2022, the voters approved medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, and industrial hemp in one measure. Kristi Noem sued the Secretary of State and had that overturned in the South Dakota Supreme Court, where they determined that was 3 separate issues, 3 separate subjects. Now, the example that I use is, what if I want to lead a measure in North Dakota to eliminate the income tax and cut the sales tax by 1 cent? Is that one issue, taxes, or is that 2 issues, income tax and sales tax? We don't know. We won't know until the Secretary of State, depending on who that is in that year, tells us whether that is the case in his own mind. In the rest of Article 3, which defines how initiated measures and constitutional measures are to be done, it creates a mechanism where the Secretary of State is in consultation with the Attorney General. But for the purposes of this single subject rule, it does not have that consultation. So it's a unilateral, undefined, almost unlimited power, which is simply the only way for the sponsoring committee to object to that is to take it to the Supreme Court. So we are creating a mechanism that is going to mandate more and more litigation in order to define what is in the Constitution. And this is from a legislature that constantly tells the people that initiated measures are poorly written.
When you go back to when Al Jagger was Secretary of State, there were instances where he, in his bias, in my opinion, ruled on something, and that's what you're setting it up for, is whether the Republicans go, we got Mike Cowan there, he's a good Republican, he'll be fine. But the pressure that comes to bear for an elected official from the outside influences, whether it's the oil industry, the Chamber of Commerce, or on the opposite side, it might be Dakota Resource Council pushing a liberal that could be in that position. So it really takes that power away from what the people's intent would be. And I don't understand why legislators would do it, is because they think they can browbeat the Secretary of State to do what they want him to do? Or what would be why would they write something that would be so open and foolish? I guess it's so they can say we're going to define it and then that power's back in their hands? Or
their justification is that we've had measures that try to stack several different things into one measure, and then those sponsoring committee folks and their petitioners focus on one thing out of 6 in their measure. Now, if they wanted to address that, I think it would actually make more sense to put a word count limit onto a constitutional measure especially. We hear the big argument is that you shouldn't legislate in the Constitution. And I tend to agree with that. There are things that are too lengthy. The Ethics Commission amendment or Marcy's Law, that was too wordy. There was too much specificity put into the Constitution for that to be a constitutional framework thing. So instead of taking a subjective and ill-defined single subject rule, maybe put a word count in it and say 250 words or less. If you can't define what you want to prevent the government from doing or allow the citizens to do then in 250 words, then maybe you should be using statute. That would be more objective than a poorly defined single subject rule.
have you done any research on that 250? You pulled it out of there. You've written about it. I've read what you had to say. Just curious because that makes sense to me. Some word number would make some sense because there are some times you need definition to go along with what you're setting up. In other words, if you just set term limits without getting enough definition to it, you are limiting what the citizens would even know what they're voting for and long term how they govern.
Yeah, and I'm not really advocating that we go down that road, but I'm just using that as an example of if that's the concern of putting too many words in the Constitution, there are other ways to do it that don't rely on subjective determinations by one person.
Dustin, let's talk about the Constitution a little bit. I got grief from somebody's watched the show and on social media that maybe I talk about raising taxes or I have somebody in from a department. I'm just having them explain what they're doing. And just the fact that we just ignore the Constitution and we need to lock in. And I don't disagree with the gentleman's point to me about having more constitutional discussion. But the reality is every time the session meets, the legislature meets or Congress meets, I think I was talking to Senator Kramer on this very show maybe a year ago, and he said, people get wound up over our Constitution, but you could fill a room the size of the studio with paper of laws that have been passed and are required and that go push the Constitution to its limit. Where's the balance in all of that?
If you talk to folks that are in elected positions, they will always say that everything they do is constitutional until they're overturned and somebody has to file a lawsuit. The way that the legislatures use the OMB budget as a catch-all at the end of every session was perfectly constitutional until it wasn't, because it took a lawsuit to do it. And in this case, it just happened to be a lawsuit by a state agency. And this was one of the rare times where the bureaucrats actually did the taxpayers a favor.
Let's talk about that a little bit as far as agency heads coming in with initiatives, and I say initiatives, not initiative measures, but bringing bills to the legislature where it's almost like, I'm almost opposed to it because, I am opposed to it. I think if they want something brought forward, they should find a sponsoring legislator that would bring it to the session and then advocate for it as opposed to agencies, because we've grown more and more with the agencies. I'm worried term limits is going to expand on that. Do you think that's possible?
I think so. I think that the compromise balance in this is that if the agencies are going to be able to bring in their own bills, that it should just be sponsored by the governor. And the governor should be able to come in and present his budget, because that's what that agency bill is. That is the governor's plan. And if the governor is not willing to personally advocate for that bill or that budget, then the legislature shouldn't be forced to simply accept it. Ironically, somebody in the past that might be more towards that approach would be like Al Carlson, who wanted the legislature to take the lead on budgets and those sort of things. But the idea that a bill, in order to be introduced, should come from a legislator is good, because the alternative is maybe we should have a process where the citizens can get 3,000 signatures and introduce a bill during session. Because if the agencies who are unelected have the power to introduce bills directly, maybe the citizens should as well.
To your point about going to the governor, that's all fine and dandy when every office is now Republican and you have them all kind of aligned. And we've had strong governors, from Burgum, who was very focused. Governor Armstrong, very much the same way. Dalrymple, not so much. He was very legislative driven. So he probably would advocate that. But when you got a Democrat, the governor would never include his offers. But that's why I advocate that legislators should specifically, because that would help drive that. So Dustin, we're going to go to the break. I want to come back. There's going to be some initiated measures on the November ballot that we want to talk about related to term limits and some other things associated with it. We're looking at initiated measures, reserving power to the people, which is what it's all about. And I think it's the legislative branch's assault on those initiatives. In fact, sometimes I think we see that coming also from executive branch initiatives as well. They're not happy. Groups like the Chamber of Commerce, or my friend Curly Hogman said, the Chamber of Commies, but I should be careful how I say that. So Dustin, let's talk about measure number 2 on the November ballots. What's in that package?
So that is the 60% threshold for constitutional measures only. Right now, to pass a constitutional measure, once the citizens of the sponsoring committee get all their signatures and it's on the ballot, right now you need 50% plus 1, a simple majority. The legislature would like to change that to 60% to make it harder for those measures to pass. In 2022, the North Dakota Chamber of Commerce spent over $400,000 trying to do this and failed to do it, even though they say it's too easy to get measures on the ballot. There was a similar attempt in 2014 to just outright ban appropriations from going into the Constitution, but they didn't differentiate between tax cuts and spending increases in their definitions of appropriations. And so the idea of banning these sort of things in their entirety was knocked down by the voters back then. But with this measure, essentially the argument is that the state constitution should be as hard to change as the federal constitution, and that simple majority is just too easy to change it. Back in 2020, the legislature tried to give themselves a veto over the people with Measure 2 in 2020. It would have allowed the legislature to veto anything constitutional that the public passes and then kick it back to the voters for a second vote. In 2024, they put forward another Measure 2 that would have required a simple majority in both the June and November elections to pass constitutional measures. That was rejected by the voters as well. And so this time it's just the 60% rule on its own. And the one thing that the supporters of this leave out, they like to say that changes to the Constitution should have overwhelming support. But what they fail to realize is that when you create a 60% requirement for the majority, you are actually empowering the minority, 40% plus 1, to stop good constitutional measures as well. And so the question is that people should have, is your fear of the bad constitutional measures greater than the benefit that would come from good constitutional measures? And should we change something that has worked for over 100 years for North Dakota just because a few outlier issues over the years have gotten through the voters? And again, this comes back to a question of trust. between the legislators whose voters they simply do not trust. The same voters that created the Republican supermajority for the last 20 years, essentially, do not trust their own voters to vote on the specific issues when they come to the ballot. And at some point, this is going to cause problems for the Republican supermajority because people are going to realize that the Republican legislature does not trust them. And I think that ultimately, the whole point of having an initiated measure system and having the Article 3 powers reserved to people is so that the voters set the terms and conditions for the legislature rather than the other way around.
Let's dig into that. What's related? Let's take the property tax initiative. That there was quite a bit of support for it, I just read an article. There's 8 states around the country right now that are saying we want to eliminate property tax. Florida being one of them, I believe. And Rick Becker led the charge on that, along with a bunch of people from, I think, Charlene Nelson. I know Brett Narlock goes back a long ways. He wasn't involved in this one, but there's been a movement like that for a long time. So they want to eliminate it through the constitutional measure, where if it got to 50% plus 1, now they're going to make that even more difficult, where people want to bring something forward like that. And that would be an example that would never probably ever pass unless there was just people are fed up with all that's going on.
Yeah, North Dakota has been way ahead of the curve on proposing those concepts. Even President Trump has said that he would support stuff like that. Of course, he's in the property business, so it makes sense. But yeah, in 2012, the first time that the elimination of property tax was on the ballot, it got 23% yes vote. In 2024, it got 38%. It's widely believed that, I definitely believe that if the next version of that was confined just to K-12 spending, to replace K-12 spending with state spending, that would overwhelmingly pass, well over 50%, because that was the big hang up with both the total eliminations in 2012 and 2024, was that it cost too much to eliminate all property taxes. But just the K-12 education portion of it would be about half as much, which would be doable. Plus, the state constitution already says that the legislature shall provide for a free and equitable and uniform education system in K-12. So arguably, the Constitution already requires the state legislature to pay for it, but since the early 80s, they've worked around that fact and simply said that by giving local school districts the ability to levy property taxes, that is their way of providing for education.
So let's talk about that a little bit. I've had multiple guests on talking about the Land Trust Fund, which was in our Constitution, which basically sets aside land, and they get mineral right dollars, they get rent of the land, that they own all these sections of land around the state, and it's a lot of land that I didn't realize, and mineral rights. That fund, I think, has grown to about $8 billion, if I recall. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
So it's about $8 billion, and it's to be used only for education. There's a portion allocated for that specific amount. If they did that and eliminate it, what would that have cut property taxes? If they were able to have an initiated measure to eliminate any funding, states got to pay for it, use the Land Trust Fund, along with other funding that comes out of the general fund, would that cut property taxes in about half or so, do you think?
The Land Trust Fund the earnings off of that fund are already being used to subsidize education to the tune of about $600 million every 2 years. And so you can't use that money twice. We're already using that to reduce it. Arguably, the dollars that are coming from the earnings from the Common Schools Trust Fund is what has allowed us to reduce the state income tax by 70% over the last 20 years, since Ed Schaefer, Dwayne Sand, and myself tried to cut the income tax in half. We're actually lower than what our target in 2007 was when we pushed for that initiated measure. The overall cost to eliminate property taxes for K-12 education in today's dollars is roughly $1.5 billion. The measure in 2024 had a price tag about $3.4 billion. $1.5 billion is doable if we get our financial house in order. But as we're seeing now, even, the state has spent so much and is committed to so much forward spending that it's going to go through another round of cuts if oil continues to drop off and there's a reduction in new drilling, which will reduce the long-term production levels And that will severely impact the state's ability to afford to do a lot of these things. But on the flip side, if the state were to commit to taking K-12 off the property tax rolls, it would reduce the amount of waste that the state could even do in the first place and eliminate the biggest part of the complaint process in property taxes, which is the K-12 education side of it. So I think ultimately, if we did that, it would kill two birds with one stone. You'd eliminate the biggest complaint about property taxes, and you would confine the legislature to spend only what's absolutely necessary in other areas, because right now, when there's more money than expected, they spend it.
So let me ask you this question just to make sure I got my math right. You had mentioned maybe a 1.5 billion for education. I think you might have said 1.6. The School Common Trust Fund, which is set aside, 8 billion, they're already contributing 600 million towards that total $6 billion general fund budget. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So what you're saying is you can't count the six twice, but the point is they're already paying a portion of that 1.5. So we're really talking about $900 million.
No, the 1.5 billion is what the local property tax share of it is.
I
the
see.
State is paying on education well over $2 billion already.
I see.
Because the state is paying the 70-75% range of K-12 education now. So in order to cover the rest of property taxes, you can't include what the state's already paying because that's already a part of the pie.
Gotcha. So they would have to be, it'd be about a $1.5 billion, which would be the issue that we're trying to deal with, eliminating property tax. And so in the case of the taxpayer, it would probably cut their property tax bill in about half if the state did it.
Close to half,
Or
yes.
close to it. And that would be a direction that it would maybe, I think the other one was a bridge too far sometimes. And I think to your point about what you said with sales tax, when you started it with Ed Schaefer, you guys started taking small bites out of the apple, and eventually, because revenues, et cetera, almost eliminated income tax.
Yeah. When we started the process on income tax reduction in 2007, everybody said nobody cares about it. Between the 2009 session and the 2013 session, we reduced the state income tax by 40%. And then in the 2023 session, in Doug Burgum's last session, he pushed for a flat tax, which ultimately reduced the effective tax rate on most North Dakotans to either zero or about 30% of what it was when we started in 2007.
We've been talking initiated measures with him on a bunch of fronts, but specifically I want to focus on Measure 1 that's going to be in the November ballot dealing with term limits. I came out and supported it last time around because I think legislators need to have some sanity brought back the way they legislate sometimes, and so I'm not a big fan of it, Dustin. Welcome to Open Range. Sometimes I always think the ballot box, so it goes a little bit of the way I think about things, but sometimes I think legislators have just been a little too arrogant about it. And I'll come to that point after. I got a point I want to make about it, but tell the viewers of Open Range about this measure.
So Measure 1 rewrites the term limits that the voters of North Dakota approved in 2022. And back in 2022, you'll recall that the initiated measure, the constitutional measure, created a new Article 15 of the state constitution and said that legislators would be limited to 8 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate. And that would not be, that the legislature would not be allowed to change that or propose changes to it. One of the provisions in there is what I call the lockout provision, which says that any changes to the term limits would have to originate with another petition of the people, because the original version started with the people. Any changes should also start with the people. The legislature does not agree with that. David Hogue has gone on the record in the lawsuit that some of the supporters of the original measure have now filed, which is being supported by U.S. term limits, and you should have one of their people on eventually to talk about this as well. They have filed a suit saying that the provision to repeal Section 4, I believe it is, out of Article 15 violates the Constitution, because that provision specifically states that the legislature shall not propose changes to term limits. And so even if you're against term limits, this question is a matter of whether you believe the Constitution means what it says. So the legislature wants to increase the term limit from 8 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate to 16 years overall through 4 complete terms. From a functional standpoint, that's a horse of peace, 8 and 8 or 16. But the real crux of this debate is whether the legislature should be able to violate the Constitution and propose a change to this at all, since that's what the people voted in favor of, was prohibiting them from doing so.
Why do you think the citizens, of course, when it passed, it passed 2-1.
Yeah.
Why do you think the citizens passed it 2-1?
I think that the citizens look at all politicians as being there too long, even if they haven't. And the idea of term limits is a very popular one on the national level and on the state level. A lot of legislators will argue that the public thought that they were voting on congressional term limits. I think that calling your own voters stupid is not a good way to go about fighting your own voters. But the public in general just has this animosity towards legislators because they think that they're like all other politicians. And frankly, when they propose things that blatantly violate the Constitution, they're not proving them wrong.
So I just saw that President Trump actually came out just recently in the last week or so about term limits, that he's supporting them, really an age issue. And of course, Jared Hendricks, who led the charge on the term limits last time, legislator now from Fargo, also had initiated a measure with age on the ballot that passed. Do you think Trump getting behind it might make some impact on a national level? Because they have ruled on a national level it's unconstitutional. So what would be the implications on a national level if President Trump, he can't sit there and sign his executive order on term limits? And obviously that's a whole different ballgame. Do they have to change the Constitution to do it, or could Congress actually themselves pass something?
Congress could themselves pass something, but it would be better if they did it through a constitutional measure. That way it's permanent. And if Congress does it themselves, a future Congress can change it without going to the states. And of course, on the national level, there isn't a ballot measure process, so it's the state legislators that would approve it. And as you mentioned, in 2024, Jared Hendricks put forward a measure that put it in the North Dakota Constitution that if you were over the age of 81, you would not be qualified to run for U.S. Senate or U.S. House. Ironically, who has really come out strongly on that concept is Rahm Emanuel, and he says it should be 75 years old. So you got Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief of staff, big-time Chicago Democrat, who actually wants to go further than Jared Hendricks.
Well, I do think Rahm Emanuel wants to run for president,
Yeah.
and I think he'd be a strong candidate for the Democrat Party.
Yeah.
I think he'd be stronger than Newsom in California just because he's such a whack job on the left, my opinion. I might be totally all wrong on that, but not that Rahm Emanuel's not, but he tends to be very careful in how he says stuff, where Newsom's all over the place most of the time. So
Yeah, he's very much like a professor or a lawyer because he is one.
Yeah.
But it just shows that these things are in the discussion realm. Now, when President Trump first ran in 2016, he also said he was for term limits, and nothing has happened in 10 years on that issue. A lot of times, politicians talk about how they're for term limits, and then once they get in, they really do nothing about it because it's just a campaign talking point.
Yeah, fair enough. So let's talk about this measure a little bit more to give the viewers. To your point is, I think I need to get somebody from U.S. term limits on to the voters. It's still till November, so it's a long ways away. But so much of it is what's driving legislators and their concern that the lobbyist state agencies are going to become the legislators de facto because people are going to be in and out of there so fast. It takes 2-3 sessions to get their perspective. Would you agree with that?
There is an argument to that fact, but when we're talking about this measure, it's important to remember that if this gets overturned, and the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case on term limits as to whether that one provision preventing the legislature from promoting and proposing a change to it, They're going to hear that in the North Dakota Supreme Court in April. They'll rule by the end of July probably. And if they rule that this measure itself is unconstitutional, this would then get removed from the ballot in November. So the whole goal of that lawsuit is to have that measure removed from the ballot entirely, just the Supreme Court did in 2020 on Measure 3 when the left of center folks wanted to put a bunch of restrictions on elected officials as well. So there's a little bit of a karma coming back on this, but we can't assume that the Supreme Court is going to go one way or the other. So until then, we have to act like this will be on the ballot, but it might not be.
Let me just get a little clarity on this, because could the legislature still put a ballot on the primary or November general election about term limits if it's not restricting it, or is it because anything touching term limits they can't touch at all? In other words, if they bring it back to a vote of the people, which is what they're doing, but it says only the people can do it. So are we saying the only way, if the court throws it out, the only way they could ever change that in the Constitution is to initiate a measure by the people?
Yes, yes. The legislature could add term limits to the other statewide officials that don't currently have them, because that provision in Article 15 only prohibits the changing of what was passed into that amendment. It does not prohibit adding to it. For the statewide electeds or local government folks, they could do that if they wanted to. Highly unlikely that they will, but that is what the crux of this entire debate is over, whether the words in the Constitution mean what they say. And right now the Constitution says the legislature shall not be able to propose any changes to the existing term limits that was passed in 2022. And if the Supreme Court gives the legislature the power to do that, to propose, then that means not only that one section is invalid, but it would mean that a lot of the other things in the Constitution are in question as well, because if the Constitution doesn't mean what it says explicitly, then what does it actually mean?
That's fascinating. So your belief is we're going to know by July. And who's defending the term limits? Is it the U.S. term limits? It's going to take money to do it, because you got the Attorney General who's on the dole of the taxpayer, who's going to be defending and supporting the legislator. He's not supporting the state's position, what the Constitution says. Is he supporting what the legislature wants?
So the U.S. term limits, and so two North Dakota citizens, Ole Larson and Terry Bierke, are the plaintiffs in this, and they are suing the Secretary of State to keep this off the ballot because it violates that section of the Constitution. The legislature agreed to and approved hiring outside lawyers to defend them. What the Secretary of State does is another question. So the legislature is one of the plaintiffs. The Secretary of State is another. The Secretary of State may have to have their own lawyers, but the question will come up whether the Attorney General has to defend what's in the Constitution, which would mean being on the side of U.S. term limits, or whether he won't take a position at all, or whether he will go on the side of the elected officials and be opposed to it. This is going to create a very strange situation in the courts, and I think that's specifically why it's going to take some time. But because initiated measures and constitutional measures have original jurisdiction in the state Supreme Court, they don't have to go through the district court process, because that could take years.
Yeah, that makes sense. Dustin, thanks for joining us in term limits. We're going to have you back as we get closer to the primary, again, talk further in it so the citizens are aware of what they're voting for. So thanks for joining us. So we've been talking to Dustin Gawrylow, Managing Director of the Watchdog Network. I'm your host, Gary Emineth. Thanks for watching.